Hello and welcome to another podcast series episode with us here at Global Wonks. I'm delighted today that we're joined by Alexandra Rogan, Senior Advisor at Santiago and former Managing Director at Teneo, who's going to be talking to us today about business and the social contract. Before I hand it over to Alexandra, just a quick point around using the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screens to submit questions for Alexandra, which we will get to in around 15 minutes. And as always, please keep the questions coming throughout the session because we look forward to them and they enrich our discussion with our guest. So with that, I'll pass it over to Alexandra.
Thank you, Bilal, and the whole Global Wonks team, and for having me here and for everyone else joining in this conversation. I want to start by recognizing that today is 1 year on from George Floyd's murder. And obviously that had a big impact on this broad discussion, reigniting the Black Lives Matter movement, and it raised questions about the roles of and relationships between business, society, and government. And this conversation is titled Business and the Social Contract, and that's really the focus here. So it's about taking a step back and thinking about the problems and the roles at play. The role of government, the direction of social change, the needs of society, the role of business. And this is why I talk about the social contract. In my view, that's the relationship and expectations and framework of engagement between business, government, and society, and how we all occupy the commons, right? Our shared spaces and shared resources. And so this includes climate change and sustainability, but also inequality and everything from education and workforce development to the responsible and inclusive application of technology. So it's a vast subject matter. And I come from a political risk background. So I bring that approach to this field, which is really about understanding the issues, who the players are, what the relationships are among them, and expectations between them. And in this conversation is going to be a little bit less about digging into the issues. So I'm happy to do some of that in the Q&A. I'm a bit more of a generalist than a subject matter expert, and Global Wonks provides the experts here. And I'm more about looking at the approach and reframing your thinking. So I'm going to split it into two sections. First, kind of setting the scene, what we're seeing and how businesses are engaging and what are the external and internal pressures on them and choices they're making. And then taking a look at more of a framework for an approach for businesses to try to address this vast subject matter. So first of all, just kind of a snapshot so we're all on the same page in terms of the dominant topics of today when we're talking about the different social and political issues. And these really are outside of the run-of-the-mill business interests and in terms of politics, sort of taxes and regulation, things like that. So it can sometimes be very unclear or vague in terms of what they actually mean directly for business operations. So, that's things like police reform, social injustice, racial inequality, systemic racism, but also a conversation we're having right now about representation and democracy, about voting right laws in states and across the country, about the January 6th insurrection on the Capitol, political contributions under review and question, about pressures coming from scrutiny of actions of foreign governments overseas. So thinking of the Shenzhen labor camps as an example and what that means around supply chains, but also about the pandemic and the whole idea of building back better. And that includes everything from global access to vaccines, local access to vaccines and appetite to take them, mask mandates, American Recovery Act, respect for the social infrastructure. So that's, looking at everything from childcare and caregivers to essential workers, and the impact of the pandemic's economic, health, and social fallouts on specific segments of the population. So for example, women in the workforce post-COVID and how we've seen a reduction of their representation there. So that seems a lot right now, and that's all very of the moment, but this has been a very persistent trend over the past decade, well, more than that really. And there are still lots of long-standing issues, and attempts to be made to address these. There are the UN SDGs, and before that, the Millennium Goals. There's B Corps and other attempts to solidify and secure business commitment to social contracts standards and shared goals. There's ESG and a whole host of climate risk disclosures, carbon emission commitments, the Paris Agreement, and especially as we head into COP26. There's responsible technology, data privacy, AI bias, and then there are lots of local or national ongoing debates. Here in the US, that's immigration, gun rights, gay rights, and a whole host of other matters. So how have businesses been responding? I think, first of all, it's important to acknowledge that business has always been a political player, and there are various ways that they engage both in society and politics. And there are business coalitions. So a lot of this discussion really caught fire in August 2019, when the Business Roundtable came out with a statement that was meant to be this watershed moment, recognizing the shift from Milton Friedman's 1970s definition of the purpose of the corporation to a more inclusive definition of business purpose, which recognized the call for stakeholder capitalism, essentially. But it's still questionable in terms of concrete changes. And there have been other business-led efforts to move away from short-term quarterly perspective and try to set corporate strategy and shareholder approach and expectations to focus more on the long-term view. There are CEO statesmen, so Jamie Dimon and Larry Fink are the ones who are out there calling for a lot of this. And there's always been political engagement. So whether that's direct government and government affairs engagement, whether it's lobbying, which can be for good or for bad, depending on your view and position too. And there are political contributions and PACs. And then they also help shape the dialogue that we're in, through marketing and media engagement, through content and thought leadership. And then there are also concrete commitments and pledges, whether that's joining the Paris Agreement and environmental pledges around their sourcing and suppliers, around workforce diversity, around capital engagement and capital allocation and investment strategies. And even closer to home, there are promises they make to their employees, benefits, and especially this has been a big thing throughout the pandemic. And of course, there's the sort of more typical philanthropy and CSR, donations and volunteerism, that sort of thing. And then what are the other organizing forces and pressures that impact decision-making for corporations? So we've seen a whole host of ratings and rankings, SASB, MSCI, TCFD, UN SDGs, the list goes on, and there's a big movement to try to also wrestle with those to make it a little bit more manageable. And then there's they really closely align with investors. And we've seen, especially here in the US, a lot of progress being made because investors got on the back of certain things eventually. So whether, especially around climate change and diversity as an example. And there's civil society and social changes. So increased awareness and changing public opinion on issues like climate change and how that affects everything from consumer trends to employee activism. And there's a lot of media out there, right? We've seen this whole host of new content verticals that address these issues, from FT's Moral Money to Bloomberg's Equality, Bloomberg Green, these dedicated reporting teams around these issues. And they can be very pro-business or a little bit more sort of critical towards business efforts. But largely, many of them are committed to holding companies to account, to tracking, and in some cases, scrutinizing their commitments against their actions, things like just capital rankings and popular information. And of course, there's a whole host of conferences and gatherings on the topic. We're all very aware of things like Davos and Aspen Institute. And of course, there's going to be COP26, as I mentioned, which is another big convening that places business and government and society on the same stage together to discuss these things. And there's politics, and everything's already heating up here in the US for 2022. Both Democrats and Republicans are making calls on business or calling out business for their engagement in these topics. So with that being the sort of background, how does a business start to determine their field of impact and create a strategy to approach these issues in a way that really reflects their business? And as I mentioned, given my background in political risk and public and government affairs, I look at this from a combination of research and stakeholder analysis, and that's both internal and external. And the big caveat here is that obviously this varies significantly by business, by your geographic footprint, whether you're consumer facing, downstream, upstream, etc. But the two main questions that I would pose is, first, how far is your reach and responsibility as a business? And most likely that's going to be determined by your operations, your footprint, and the range of stakeholders and issues. But it also goes back to that idea of social contract. What's the relationship between the three, society, business, and government, and the idea of this shared commons? And then secondly, what are the regulatory and legislative trends codifying and formalizing business responsibilities? What are you going to be forced to do anyway? And so really it's about trying to build a flexible framework, because these things are going to constantly change, but a framework which identifies and assesses issues and priorities. And so it supports a strategy going forward. And I think there are a few important things to recognize. First is that a lot of these issues don't fit nicely into one department. And so you have to recognize the silos within a business. And you have to try to bring together a diverse leadership that represents all the different functions to address this. So that's government affairs, communications, including advertising and marketing, general counsel and legal, investor relations and financial planning, risk and security and operations, and the CEO and board leadership as well. And then identifying issues and stakeholders. And here, I think it's most useful to really bring in external views as well, because the whole point here is to be outward looking and not just focused on the issues that you've already identified as important to your business. This is really about identifying your surroundings and the other players there. And so it's really important to understand the issues and stakeholders in an unbiased and as comprehensive as possible way. And that's where bringing in external experts can help in terms of framing up that landscape for you. And then you go to prioritizing. And this is where it gets really tough and personal, and it's very company specific. So you have to start by understanding your guiding principles as a company, if you have them. And that might be a mission, a purpose, it might be values, it might be your culture, but understand how those might intersect with these issues as we go along, and the expectations and commitments you've already made to stakeholders. And then understanding the likelihood and potential impacts of different issues. Make sure again that you're getting fresh thinking, it's not biased or well-trodden. Recognize that things are going to change, right? Politics will change, consumer trends, demographics. And then you've got to be really honest about stakeholder prioritization. We'll like to say we care about everyone, but really there are business decisions to be made, but also recognize how it might change depending on your current status, where you are as a company right now, but be cognizant of how a decision based on your now will restrict your options later down the line. And not everything is going to win out. There are going to be lots of negotiations among internal stakeholders. Often there's lots of politics at play internally as well. But you've got to be clear about what you're choosing to prioritize and why, and what are the trade-offs and the inherent risks you might be taking on. And this isn't about solving for every issue, right? Back to the idea of the social contract. It's about understanding the stakeholder expectations of a business. Whether you agree with them or not comes into the decision-making piece. But understanding your impact and the benefits or advantages you garner from these, bringing that all into the decision of how you'll engage in an issue, and understanding that you're not the only actor here. So if it's outside of your purview of action, where does that lie? What role should you have in that? What influence do you have? And all of this has to circle back to the internal stakeholders to feed into the strategy forward once the prioritizations have been made. So you put a plan in place to move forward, which takes into account communications, government affairs, investor relations, executives, employees, but not everyone has a role to action necessarily, but the exercise is important. It strengthens and processes and embeds communication and a framework approach to these issues. And it's really important also to understand what decisions will mean for different functions, how a policy advocacy position will affect your employees, and how communications to one audience will be heard by another. I think it's important to actively think about a hypocrisy lens, saying one thing but doing actions elsewhere that conflict. And it's important to make sure you understand stakeholder expectations and what they'll hold you to. So being clear on tangible outcomes and measurements if you are making commitments. But also this all has to kind of be flexible. It's not set in stone. It has to be revisited often because the world changes. And then finally, just at some point, you'll get it wrong too. And that's why the process is so important, because it informs the management of the strategy when things do hit a speed bump. And it establishes a multi-stakeholder internal and external approach. And it's just as much about creating a culture in which political and social risk and opportunity are part of every function and embedded in corporate strategy. So I think I've just gone on for probably my limit, and there's a lot to put out there. But I'd love to dig into some questions and just kind of have more of a discussion from there.